In this video, I'll do my very best to answer an excellent question from a comment under our last video. Mark, quick question regarding your intro. How does mastering for vinyl differ from mastering for digital? Do you do any high-low passing, compression, stereo folding, etc., or do you go for a neutral master and leave any vinyl-specific requirements to the cutting engineer? So that's a great question, and the answer is it depends on several factors. So let me talk about the bulk of my work with labels and the artists on them and my approach to mastering, and then I'll move on to the specific things I may or may not do for a vinyl master and why, and look at why I've been considering investing in a vinyl cutting lathe for us here, but probably won't. The bulk of my work is for record labels that release music in two ways: albums of music and singles of music. These are generally in streaming, CD and vinyl format, and the albums are usually destined for music fans who have a half-decent and in some cases very decent hi-fi system at home, and the singles are generally destined for clubs, DJs, collectors and home DJs who love vinyl and might do the occasional gig. In terms of my professional work, I niche down. I work and have a reputation for working in a limited number of genres. Most of the labels I work for are putting out jazz, funk, soul, African, Caribbean and Latin music. The jazz crowd are discerning in a very positive way. The music is usually exceptionally well produced by a producer who works in jazz and nothing else. The recordings are first class, they are very well mixed, and the producers and artists know what they want and how to get it. And by the time it reaches me, it already sounds like their intention for the record. So my job sonically is to do as little to it as possible. I have a good relationship with the labels and the artists on them, and they know what they want from me, and my job in the majority of cases is to prepare 3 lots of files for the various distribution platforms: digital files at a healthy level for streaming that doesn't break the mix, DDP files for CD production, and digital files for cutting to vinyl. And they generally all sound pretty much the same, and pretty much the same as the mixes. I could pluck a handful of records out of our room next door that have my name on as a mastering credit, and of those there are probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 where sonically I've actually done nothing at all. Not a thing. And that's because I have a good relationship with the clients and artists, and I know at no point when sending those files off was I going to get an email back saying, "But you didn't do anything." And I have to recognize when it's my job not to do anything, and that was the hardest thing to learn. It's my job to preserve the mixes the producers and artists love and have put a huge amount of work into, and make sure that they translate to the end product whilst doing as little as possible to them sonically, unless it improves the mixes as the artist intended. Now, sometimes I might pick up on something. I recently mastered an EP of remixes of a single that had done very well for a debut release for a new soul artist on the label. On one of the remixes, I just felt the vocal was a little bit low. It didn't sit well with the other tracks on the EP, which were all remixed by different name producers and DJs in the genre. So I contacted the label manager and expressed my opinion, and he agreed. He contacted the artist and she agreed too. The producer who had remixed that particular track for the EP was now working abroad and wouldn't be able to revisit the mix for a month or so. So I brought the vocal up just 1 dB using Isotope's master rebalance, sent a version out for approval, and everyone thought I'd performed some kind of voodoo and were very, very happy. So that's one example of a situation in which I might suggest a change to a mix. I was also applying a little more EQ than I would do to a jazz record across the tracks on this soul EP, particularly in the low end, to get the tracks to sit better together as a whole, to sound like a cohesive release. Funk records need to be louder, particularly in the mid-range, and often need some low end rolled off, and that's because they're played in clubs by DJs who still cart around cases of 7-inch singles. But the producers, the artists and the mix engineers of these records know that, and they usually get to me a lot louder with a stronger mid-range. With amateur clients, amateur not meant in a negative way at all, I'm often doing a lot more. I get a lot of test masters, to do from you, our audience, and the quality of the music some of you are producing is pretty incredible. But sometimes there might be issues in the low end I need to address that might be missed in a home monitoring environment. Sometimes everything sounds just a little bit kind of flat and dull, and I can bring some depth and sparkle to it. And sometimes there's a really great song with a really great recording of a really great performance that's been massively over processed at the mix stage, or might have been mixed by someone from the band who hasn't really mixed anything before, they're new to it. And then it's my job to contact that person and say, look, your song is fantastic, but the mix is, you know, it's not really there yet. Can we work together to bring it up a level? And often we do, and they'll send me the multi-tracks and I'll remix it, and importantly show them what I've done. And that makes their next mix a whole lot better and takes time, and I have to charge for that, but that can be of huge value to that person going forward. That's where passive education from watching YouTube videos or signing up for online mixing courses has limited value. You only really learn what someone else is doing to someone else's mix, not what you should try and do with yours. Panning the guitar hard right and the reverb and delay from it hard left isn't appropriate for every song, and that's where a YouTube education kind of fails. So before I actually answer your question, mastering is all about communication and knowing what expectations are, and initially determining if you're a good fit, if you as an artist suit your mastering engineer, and if your mastering engineer suits you. And that's why we launched the free Test Master service last year. It achieves several things for us and you at no financial risk. If I get a stunning jazz track from one of you that needs very little doing to it, as I did yesterday, that's a good fit. If I get a Christian pop song through that's an incredible song but the mix isn't very good and I can help to make it good, we're a good fit. The Ukrainian metal band who loved the sound of my master but insist that it's slammed to -5 LUFS because that's what all the Ukrainian metal bands are doing, not such a good fit, and we both now know that, and hello if you're watching. And sometimes I'll get tracks through for a test master from someone who has sent it out to several people, several other mastering engineers for a test master, and they get them all back and they decide to go with someone else, and that's fine too. That's what it's all about, determining if I'm a good fit for you and you're a good fit for me. Importantly, it also gives us a good indication of where our most engaged and loyal audience members are in their productions, and that in turn enables us to tailor our content on this very YouTube channel to try and help you. But to answer the question with regard to whether I tailor the masters intended for vinyl specifically for vinyl or leave that to the cutting engineer, the answer is, again, it depends, but there's always a conversation, and that conversation usually starts by defining responsibilities. Producing any physical format is expensive, and if it goes wrong, which it sometimes does, and a whole batch of CDs or vinyl records have to be destroyed, it's someone's fault. If a physical vinyl record sounds awful or in extreme cases won't even play, I need to make sure it's not my fault. Similarly with CD production, I'm sending DDP files back to the label to be forwarded to the replication plant, and if there's a problem, we need to have had that chain of communication in place to determine where the problem lies. Recently I got a panicked phone call from a label manager saying that the CD plant had called and the 85-minute album wouldn't fit on the CD, the maximum playback time of which is 80 minutes. So I thought, loaded the project here with the DDP image I'd created, and the album came in at 78 minutes. But the digital streaming version came in at 85 because there was a bonus track. The assistant at the label responsible for uploading the files to the streaming services and sending the DDP files to the replication plant for production had sent the files for streaming to the plant instead, and they'd got the wrong files despite me having labelled the folders files for digital streaming and DDP files for CD production. So with vinyl, as I have enough knowledge to know what will and won't cut successfully, I send a separate set of files in a folder labelled files for vinyl cutting that may be a little quieter depending on the genre, but will ensure that even if a monkey cuts the record, it should still sound okay and at the very least play. But the responsibility for that is pretty much always with the cutting engineer. He or she are cutting the record, and the files I'm sending have been signed off and approved by the artist and the label. But what can make a record sound bad, and what can I do to try and minimise that? Well, a vinyl record is a pretty prehistoric thing by modern standards, and the simplified production process is as follows. The record is cut to an aluminium disc that's coated with a lacquer. This lacquer is very soft in nature and allows a vinyl cutting lathe, essentially an enormous record player in reverse, to cut the groove. The lacquer is then placed on a platter, and this platter has a formation of tiny holes in it and is connected to a vacuum pump. The vacuum does two things. It sucks the lacquer down tightly onto the platter so as it won't slip or move when cutting the record, and it's also sent to the cutting head to remove the flux, which is the lacquer that's actually cut out during the process, and it removes that and places it in a sump to be later disposed of. The lathe uses a cutting head to actually cut the groove, the ruby tipped head moving in response to the electrical audio signal fed into it, much like a stylus in reverse, and the result is a V-shaped groove in the lacquer that looks very similar to the V-shaped groove you'll find in the finished product. This lacquer can then be taken off and played on a standard record player, albeit only once because the lacquer is soft, so by playing it you're effectively destroying what you've just cut. Because of this, and because lacquers are very expensive, most cutting engineers will do a test cut of a portion of the record on either a scrap piece of lacquer or sometimes on the edge of an oversized lacquer that will be trimmed off at the next stage in the manufacturing process. Once the lacquer is cut, it's then carefully packaged up and it goes off to be silver plated, and this silver layer is peeled off to form the reverse of your record and then used to form a stamper, the A side and B side on two separate stampers that then squash molten vinyl in between them whilst simultaneously applying the label, and there's your record. Because vinyl is actually a very technically limited format, with playback requiring a needle or stylus to sit in the groove, respond and have its tiny movements converted back into electrical current, there are a few things you need to be aware of. The first is vinyl real estate. For a record to sound good, you can only reasonably expect to get 16 to 18 minutes of music per side. The reason for that is that in order to be able to squeeze more on, you have to cut a narrower and shallower groove, and that just doesn't sound as good. And because the groove naturally gets tighter as you move into the center of the record, there being much more real estate on the outside than there is in the middle, sequencing or track ordering in your album can play an important part to avoid what's known as inner groove distortion. You don't want your loudest or most dynamic tracks physically at the end of a side in the middle of the record. For those of you that were buying records up to the advent of the compact disc, you might wonder why, or you might have wondered why, some of the albums you had on vinyl had a different track order when the CD came out. Well, this is usually because the desired sequencing had to be compromised in order to cut a better sounding record, but CD doesn't care. It's digital information, it works or it doesn't. So the sequencing of that could be the actual desired track order as intended originally by the artist. When cutting vinyl, you also have to pay particular attention to the low end and the high end. Bass equals energy, and a very bass heavy record will need to be cut at a lower level overall in order to cut a groove large enough to reproduce it. This is why many records of old, particularly 1980s records, can sound very bass light by modern standards. Radio stations and clubs were only playing vinyl records, and so the race began to get your record to sound louder than those being played either side of it, and a lot of that loudness perception comes from the mid-range. So records were often mixed and mastered bass light in order to be able to increase perceived volume. Speed also affects recording and playback as it does with tape, hence the 45 RPM record appearing for singles, and the reason why most 12-inch singles also play at 45 RPM as opposed to 12-inch albums which play back at 33 1/3 RPM. The 12-inch single at 45 RPM was actually pretty much as good as vinyl got. With regard to the top end, the higher the frequency, the faster the cutting head has to cut the groove, and the faster the stylus has to play it back. Recording a 20 kHz signal means that the cutting head has to move at 20,000 times a second, and that means it gets hot. And if it gets hot, it burns out. And if it burns out, you can't cut any more records until you've ordered a new one, and you can't order a new one anymore, and even when you could, they were tens of thousands of pounds. So there were equalizers built into the lathes that slowly rolled off pretty much everything above 14, 15, 16 kilohertz, and later lathes were fitted with heat sensors that let you know when the head was getting too hot, and also used helium to cool them down. Many cutting engineers adopted the practice of half-speed cutting or half-speed mastering for really high fidelity releases. The tape machine that used to feed the master into the lathe played back at half speed, and the record was cut at half speed. This meant that instead of the cutting head having to cut say a 14 kilohertz signal, it was only working at 7 kilohertz. Cutting heads are also very sensitive to sibilance and harsh frequencies in the high mids, so the lathes often had a hardware de-esser built in, effectively a frequency dependent compressor tuned to the sibilant frequencies. So am I folding in the stereo image, particularly in the low end? Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Again, it depends on the intention of the artist, where the record's going, how loud it needs to be. So a funk record is going to have the bass in the middle because that energy needs to be evenly distributed between left and right channels. If it's a delicate jazz record and maintaining a stereo image of the band is important, there might be an upright bass panned off to the left hand side because that's where the upright bass player was in the room, in the soundstage. Then it's important to leave it there if that's what the artist wants. So in that case, I won't mono the bass, and I'll have a conversation with the cutting engineer saying, you shouldn't mono the bass either. Cut the record a little bit quieter so we can keep the bass where it needs to be in the stereo image. All of this makes cutting lacquers for vinyl production a laborious and highly skilled task. Mistakes in cutting mean you have to throw the lacquer away and start again, and lacquers are expensive. Fry the cutting head and you're going to be left with a very expensive bill and a very long wait to get it repaired, if it's even able to be repaired. There are no off-the-shelf parts available anymore, so any mechanical parts needed have to be fabricated. Lathes haven't been manufactured since 1982, and even then not many were made, as they were such a huge investment at the time, and still are when they come up for sale today. Now, I know of one for sale in the UK at the moment, a Neumann VMS80, which is the pinnacle of cutting lathe technology, and the current owner wants around £500,000 for it. But with the current 6-month turnaround time just to get your record cut, and lacquers having to be electroplated within 72 hours of having been cut because they're soft and deteriorate, I've actually been in discussion with a couple of labels I regularly work for in regard to investing and getting one here. Now, this would mean that cutting time for those labels would then be reduced to weeks from months, and if we opened a facility that could electroplate the lacquers as soon as they've been cut, that would potentially increase the quality of the finished product, as there would be no degradation in the lacquer from cutting to plating. Currently, there's only one facility in the world I know of that's electroplating its own lacquers, and that is being run by Chris Mara of Welcome to 1979 in the US. But there are two factors holding me back. The first is my environmental concerns. Vinyl is incredibly bad for the environment. Not only is the manufacturing process damaging, but vinyl records can't be recycled. They off-gas noxious fumes when handled and played and even stored. And whilst there are a handful of green processing plants opening up that promise a more environmentally friendly approach, vinyl is really a pretty stupid format in 2022. It's technically inferior to digital in every measurable way, be it frequency response, dynamic range, or noise floor. Whatever element you can pluck out of the air, really, although the purists will argue against that until one of you slashes the other one's throat with the swift flick of a 45. And I think we'll very soon see ways of manufacturing the stampers that don't require cutting a lacquer. Laser etching in particular. Developments are already being made in this area, and if they do come to fruition, then it really will be my fault if a record doesn't play. But for the time being, I will continue to send dedicated folders to labels with dedicated masters for vinyl after having had a conversation with the cutting engineer regarding their requirements and their expectations from me. Time to wrap this one up, because I've now got a master and album that's being solely distributed on cassette. If you enjoyed this, then please hit the thumbs up, and don't forget to take advantage of our free test master offer using the link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and you'll see us in the next video.